Just a few minutes after 6 o'clock, so we will go ahead and formally get started with tonight's meeting. Again, welcome. My name is Rakia Nance, and on behalf of the Anne Arundel County Department of Public Works, I'd like to welcome you to tonight's informational meeting to discuss the Our Water program as it relates to the Pines on the Severn and Hidden Hills community, as well as surrounding communities. I'd like to note tonight's meeting is being recorded, and further on in the presentation, we'll explain how you can access the meeting recording and also the presentation slides. Here are some of the people you'll be hearing from on the call tonight. From the Department of Public Works, we have Julie Paluda and George Heiner. From HDR, in addition to myself, there's Brian Balchunas and Megan Robinson. Tonight's meeting is being hosted on Zoom, and here's an overview of the tools and features that you'll be able to use. We'll ask that you please mute yourself if you're not speaking, and to ensure optimal bandwidth, please turn off your camera. We will be pausing several times during tonight's presentation. We have a lot of information to share with you, and so we ask that you enter your questions into the chat box, and we will address them in the order in which they are received. The purpose of tonight's meeting is to share information about the Our Water program. We've received interest from residents in the community. I want to note that this meeting is non-binding, and we're not asking you to make any sort of decision this evening. Instead, this meeting is designed to help you learn more and make an informed decision on whether or not to connect to public sewer. Please keep in mind that it is a community decision whether to connect to public sewer, and we encourage you to talk with your neighbors about the information you've learned tonight. Here's an overview of the information we'll be presenting. We'll begin with a bit of discussion about the Our Water program as it relates to Pines on the Severn, Hidden Hills, and surrounding areas. Then we'll discuss funding and costs, followed by the application and petition process, and then we'll set aside some time to discuss next steps and extended Q&A. And with that, I'll turn things over to George Heiner from the Department of Public Works to discuss the Our Water program. George?
Thanks, Rakia, and good evening, everyone. So I'm George Heiner with Anne Arundel County Department of Public Works, the Utility Design Division. And I'm going to talk in a couple different pieces of tonight's presentation, but the first section I'm going to talk about is the background to the Our Water program and what are our basic goals with the septic to sewer connection program and what it might look like in your part of the county. So what is Our Water? Our Water is an integrated program that the county has developed to provide a long-term strategy to maintain the health of our waterways and improve the Chesapeake Bay and strengthen water resiliency. Go to the next slide. So we have 5 components to the program, and the first component on the right there is small systems upgrade. This is a program where we're going to be looking at taking over small wastewater treatment plants and upgrading them to state-of-the-art treatment technology. We have our stormwater improvements program, which is funded through the stormwater fee and really is run by the Bureau of Watershed Protection and Restoration. They've made a lot of great progress on stormwater restoration projects throughout the county. We have a groundwater resiliency component that we'll be looking at in the near future. And we have wastewater treatment enhancements. The county's invested a great deal of funds over the last 10 years at our wastewater treatment plants, and they are now removing very high levels of wastewater and nitrogen, very high levels of nitrogen and other pollutants. And so we want to look to optimize that performance and look for other enhancements. But the part we're here to talk about tonight is the septic to sewer connection program. And that's a new program that the county's developed to try to make it more affordable for people on septic systems to connect to the public sewer system. You can go to the next slide. So why is making the switch beneficial? The main reason there's a great benefit in this is, as I mentioned before, our wastewater treatment plants are performing at a very high level, and they were able to remove about 90% more of the pollutants than a traditional conventional septic system. And so we really want to take advantage of the performance that we're getting out of those treatment plants, and with every connection we'll see a substantial reduction in nitrogen loads. Can you go to the next slide? So we show some of those relative contributions on this slide. On the far right, we show what's known as the critical area, and the assumed discharge from a conventional septic system per household per year is 18 pounds per year. If you have a nitrogen reducing unit, or if you've heard of one, sometimes they're called BATs, those can typically remove 50% of the nitrogen. So that's a substantial improvement from a conventional system, and it's about 9 pounds per year in the critical area. But you can see our wastewater plants are producing an equivalent of what would be 3 pounds per year. And that is actually based on our performance requirement of 4 milligrams per liter. Our actual performance has been less than that. And so the real load right now is equivalent load to be around 2.5 pounds per person per year. So that's really why there's a water quality benefit from connecting septic systems. It's really through that optimizing the kind of performance that we're getting out of wastewater plants. We're taking advantage of that performance. Can you go to the next slide? So the septic connection program was developed around this idea of trying to, that the county would try to optimize and prioritize its contributions or investment in septic system connections. And so we'll be talking a little bit more about areas that we're calling eligible areas, and they're really the focus of the program. On this diagram, the blue areas that really are pretty much adjacent to the waterways. And we'll talk more about what makes an area eligible, but the green on this diagram is the county's sewer service areas, kind of in aggregate. And the blue are the areas that really are focusing on as part of the septic sewer connection program. Can you go to the next slide? So overall, we have a need that we want to address, which is to protect our waterways and improve the environmental, public health, environment, and the water quality. We've developed this new process, which we're going to talk about in more detail as we go through the presentation tonight, which is that neighborhoods show interest. We're going to try to communicate to everybody what the program is, and then learn about how it's funded, and then neighborhoods, if they're interested, would move eventually to the petition process and make the conversion. And overall, our goal is to try to connect 6,000 septic systems over the next 30 years. So that's about 200 homes a year. The county currently has over 40,000 septic systems throughout the county. So, while we're trying to make a significant impact in, making connections, it's certainly not the majority of systems that we're trying to connect. Go to the next slide. So a little bit of just going to a little bit more background on the program. If you've heard of the Chesapeake Bay Total Maximum Daily Load Requirement, known as the TMDL, the earlier versions of that were looked at nitrogen load reductions by sector, and in the septic sector, the county's goal was identified as being a reduction of almost 50% in the septic sector load. So that caused us to really start looking at how would you connect up to 20,000 septic systems. So we did a lot of initial concept planning really years ago now, with the idea of how would we even identify some feasible locations. And the next step that really we went into was the county convened, DPW convened a septic task force, which was made up of different elements as environmental interests, business community interest, and some community representatives. And we presented the different challenges with this 20,000 septic system connection program, and really tried to pull from the task force ideas on policies, prioritization criteria, subsidies, and how we might modify the existing petition process in the county code to try to get more people to be able to connect to public sewer. And that effort culminated with new legislation last year that was passed by the council, and we're going to get into more detail on those elements. But the main changes were that the county is now able to offer a subsidy to certain projects in eligible areas, and that if you're in an eligible area, you are able to defer partial deferment of your annual assessment. Some other changes were that the county no longer uses a front foot assessment approach. If you've ever looked at doing a petition before, you'll probably recognize that term. If you haven't, it's not really that important. How the projects are divided up by the number of homes that are number of lots that are served now. And also the payments in eligible areas are spread over a 40-year period. Since we have so many possible project areas and our funding is going to be limited, so we've also developed an application and a ranking system that's going to allow us to sift between potential projects as we do an application cycle. So we're going to talk more about that later today. And I forgot to mention, I know I've seen a few questions come in. We do have a number of different spots in the presentation where we're going to stop for questions, and we really encourage everybody to ask questions as we go along. There's a lot of information that we're going to go over tonight in a couple different subject areas. So yeah, please feel free to put any of your questions in the chat box, and when we get to a mini pause, we'll get caught up on questions. So let's go to the next slide. So what makes an area an eligible area? I mentioned that eligible areas were defined or given the priority in the program. They're actually the areas defined in the code as being eligible for the subsidies and those partial deferments. And an eligible area has a couple key features, or can have one of a couple key features. So one is that you're in the critical area. Another is that you're in what's known as an on-site wastewater management problem area. Another would be that you're in what's called the septic sewer connection area, which really means you're in an area that we had done a layout for several years ago when we were originally trying to identify 20,000 septic system connections. Or you're part of a project that includes those areas. So even if your particular property is not in an eligible area, if you're part of a project area that includes an eligible area, you become eligible, through that. In this particular instance, this community area, there are areas, I think, on the western side that are in the critical area, and that would be the connection to being eligible. Why don't we go to the next slide? So on this slide, we have shown a couple different areas, and I guess this is a really large area that we're talking to this evening. So one thing, I guess, that we want to point out is there's some polygon areas in the dark red that are shown on here, and these are the two main drainage areas that we defined when we did these concept layouts several years ago. So the idea when we were doing these was we looked at them not really with any overlay of what was the neighborhood definition at all. We really looked at the topography and some other basic layout criteria and tried to figure out where we might be able to make these connections. This area is unique in that the connection point is really over to the east side there at Whispering Woods. And so we would need to basically pump over to that area in order to connect into our existing system. And the areas on the western edge here are really the areas that are in the critical area. So to some extent, this is an area that in order for the whole area to be eligible, we would kind of have to get sort of most of the area would have to come in. Now, within that context, though, there's some flexibility. There's a couple key criteria when we define the project area. Is it has to be contiguous properties from the point of connection back to the end of the property area, but that could be one street wide. It doesn't have to be 2 streets wide, right? So, and as if there's interest in this is such a big area, I think probably the best thing to say is if there are some communities that are interested, we can certainly meet with any smaller group, later on to discuss what possible layouts might look like. But anyway, that's the basic idea, and I guess I want to emphasize, because I know this has been a confusion point in some other presentations. There is no contract that's been proposed by the county, and this isn't a planned project area that we're going forward with. This is just a concept area that we developed several years ago, and we show it to the communities just so you can get a picture of where we think a possible service area or a drainage area is around your area. But the project area itself could be much smaller than what we're showing on here. Because in the petition process, and we'll talk more about this later, the actual what's going on is the residents in an area are petitioning Public Works for an extension of public sewer, and there's a map that goes with that. So the residents are petitioning Public Works saying, will you extend service to these properties? And there's like a map that goes with that. And the homeowners have to sign a form saying, I'm interested in this petition or I'm not. So I guess that's the main points I wanted to get over with the on the project area. I see we have a few questions, so let me see.
Yes, George, the first question, what fraction of the community must approve the shift to move forward?
Okay, we'll go over that in more detail at the end of a couple different steps. It's going to be a majority needs to approve. It's a 50+1. But I want to emphasize that tonight's meeting is not a vote on anything. And we'll go over, there's a couple different steps where DPW would be coming back to you with updated costs and a formal ballot as part of the voting process.
Okay, next question. We were told that a pumping station would need to be built in our community, and that would make us not eligible. I hope I'm interpreting that correctly.
I'm not sure at what point you would have been told that, but I mean, we are looking at all these possible layouts now. So, I mean, yes, a pumping station might have to be built. That wouldn't necessarily make it not eligible. What would happen is the cost that would be folded into the cost to provide service to the area, and that cost is reimbursed to the county. So it will definitely impact the cost, but it doesn't mean it couldn't happen. And that is, in fact, how a lot of areas would possibly be served, is through a pumping station. But the pumping stations are expensive. And actually, one thing I forgot to mention on the project area, there is very generally an economy of scale with a bigger project, right? So the more properties are involved, the less generally it's going to cost per property, and that certainly is the case when there's a pumping station involved.
All right, next question. George, could you clarify, did you say payments are spread out over 30 or 40 years?
So the payments are spread out over 40 years, but we'll be talking in more detail about that in a little bit later.
Okay, and a point of clarification, if your house isn't in the blue area shown on the map, you are excluded in Hill, not Glen Eden?
I'm having a little trouble reading the community names, but if you are not in the blue area on one of the other maps, I think we're not talking about this map here. I think we're talking about one with the bright green.
Yeah, I think he is talking about this map.
Oh, he's talking about this map?
Yes.
Okay, so, oh, I'm sorry. Okay, so here, the blue on the map is only trying to show the neighborhoods that are defined. I think this is taken off a county GIS layer. So it's not relevant to whether you're eligible or not. We're just trying to show the community layers on this one. The eligibility depends on kind of where you are with respect to the other map.
And everything within the red borders here is eligible and could be part of a project area.
I see a question. Would a pumping station be constructed for best pumping for 100% participation or for the agreed participants? We'll get into the details of this more, but the basic program is it's voluntary on a community basis, but within the community, it becomes mandatory once the project goes forward. Right? So the community vote would be, a community could vote for or against the project, but the threshold is majority approval. So 50 plus 1% would go forward, but once that project goes forward, the connection is mandatory by everybody in the project area. There are some exemptions that can be granted if you recently had a septic system put in, but that exemption would only be to the timeline on connection and not to the property assessment. So it's important, I guess, to communicate with within your neighborhood about the projects.
It looks like we're all caught up in the questions, George.
Okay, great. So I'm gonna hand it off now to Brian Galtunis with HDR. HDR is a consulting firm that's been helping us with all sorts of components of the program, and he's going to talk a little more detail about how the projects are funded and where some of the costs are, and how that basically is turned into an assessment. So I'll hand it over to you, Rob.
Thanks, George. So we're going to start actually on the cost side, and what costs there are for building new sewer systems within built-up communities already, like yourself. And then we'll talk about the funding more and the things both the county's doing and state funding opportunities to help reduce the overall cost to the homeowner. So if we start just thinking about the project and the typical total cost to build a project, the biggest chunk of this is building the infrastructure in the county public right of way to collect the sewage, take it to a pumping station, build the pumping station, build the force main to discharge into the county system. So that's the bulk of the cost, and that's really what turns in to the assessment. So all of that work is on the public right of way. Now there is some private on-site costs that would traditionally be the responsibility of the homeowner. Again, we'll talk about funding sources here in a minute, but those on-site costs are the cost to abandon your existing septic system and also then run the sewer from your home to the public right of way, to the clean out that's just inside the public right of way. And we'll talk here in a minute about some average costs for doing that. And then lastly, there's what's called a capital facility connection charge. And this is the charge. The county has built up wastewater infrastructure already. You would be discharging into that built up wastewater infrastructure. They would be absorbing this wastewater into their existing wastewater treatment plant. So this is really the fund that kind of pays for their previous investments and your piece of those previous investments. So if we talk briefly, we get a lot of questions about what happens to your septic system. So when you connect public sewer, the county requires you to abandon the septic system. Abandonment can be, obviously it would be pumped out. For a concrete septic tank, it would just filled with stone and backfilled. If you had a metal septic tank, it would need to be crushed to avoid hazards in the future, and then again filled in. This does require the service of a licensed disposal system contractor to pump the tank out, or liquid waste hauler to do that. And then the rest of your on-site work will be done by a master plumber. So if we look at average costs, as George just talked about, the county has developed layouts for many different areas, including the two drainage areas that we're talking about here today, and developed conceptual cost estimates for all of those layouts. And you see here kind of the histogram of the average cost for all of those layouts. For the communities we're looking at here, we're a little bit on the higher side. And the reason for that is really what George talked about, that to connect into the existing system, we have to go considerable distance with a force main over to the Whispering Woods area of Arnold. So that really adds to some of the project costs here. Other things that impact the project costs: property sizes, larger properties, more distance between sewers, and higher cost. The depth of the sewers, number of grinder pumps in some cases will be topographically challenged and not able to flow by gravity, and those homes may require an individual grinder pump that the county would own and maintain, but those are more expensive to put in. For your area, a pump station will be required. Some areas can connect directly by gravity. And then finally, surface restoration, street closures, maintenance of traffic, those things can all impact average project costs. We are very conceptual at this point with project costs. You know, if a community was interested and eventually got to a petition project, those costs would firm up significantly. Excuse me. Next slide shows the average historical private on-site costs. So these are those what would traditionally be paid out of pocket by a homeowner. These are heavily influenced. You'll see kind of a bell curve, but then an increase towards the back end. This is based on data from the health department, which administers some of the BRF, the Bay Restoration Fund grants that can go to help offset these on-site costs. And they're really impacted by where your sewer is, where your house is relative to the right-of-way, because of the length of the sewer that may need to go to the right-of-way, the property topography, how much driveway or landscaping restoration might need to be done. You know, bring in a sewer from the back of the house where your septic tank is to the front of the house where a new connection is, can all impact it. You'll see mostly the costs here range between the $2,000 to $8,000, but there is that blip on the higher side for those that have really long runs or what have you to get to the public right away. So I do see a couple of questions. How does septic abandonment affect building code restrictions for home improvement expansion? George, I believe that you would not have any septic restrictions anymore once you're connected to public sewer. Is that correct?
Sorry, I had myself muted. So if the restriction that you mean is occasionally sometimes people aren't able to build an addition to their house or some other modification, and that restriction is connected to their septic system. So if you make connections to the public sewer, then that would alleviate that restriction. The second question is, does a metal tank need to be removed, and is there a cost associated to that? So mostly the tanks the metal ones I believe are crushed and left in place. I think concrete ones are kind of perforated on the bottom and then they're filled. And I believe that's an acceptable abandonment method. If you have some intention to build something back there, then yeah, you would have to obviously remove that. So, let's see.
The second part to that question, George, is how do we get a formal estimate as to what the costs will actually be?
Okay. So each homeowner would have to work with a plumber individually with respect to their site. So DPW does not provide or really facilitate the homeowners and kind of finding the plumber and getting that estimate. So that would be something that the homeowner would need to address.
Next question, many Pines houses have a septic tank in the backyard and far downhill from the road. Would that likely require an individual grinder pump and thus high cost?
Yes, if that is your situation, if you can go back a couple slides, Rakia, to the bar chart, the one for the one that
after that, the next one.
One after that. The one after that. Yeah, I mean, as Brian mentioned, we have this data from the health department. We did not sort of cross-reference this data and analyze the individual properties. So I can't tell you with that we've reviewed it in that detail, but in terms of our looking at it, that's the circumstances you're describing is I think where this 10 to 15% of people who had to pay between $14,000 and $18,000. I think those are probably a situation where their house is far away and maybe downhill from the road, and maybe the septic tank is on the back of the house. So there's a combination of a long run to get to the street and maybe driveway restoration or one pump going further up. So yeah, I think that's possible.
A couple points on there as well. It's really going to depend on where you're, as far as a grinder pump, when that would be required. It's going to be where your sewer comes out of your house compared to what we can do topographically in the road for sewer installation. So, some of these sewers could be relatively deep in the street and still be able to take flow by gravity from backyards, and it just depends. If the street's at a higher elevation than your house, then you may have to install a grinder pump, but it would just depend on the situation. And then the other point on grinder pumps is that the grinder pumps are part of the overall project cost because they would be owned and operated by the county. So if a individual home needed to have a grinder pump, they would not have a higher assessment than maybe their next door neighbor that didn't need a grinder pump, because it's all part of the project cost. A lot of grinders may make the project cost higher, and that's everybody's assessment's higher, but as an individual homeowner, you would not see a hit for your house being on a grinder pump.
Well, I guess the caveat there would be it depending on if your house is far down slope from the main road, you might have to pump up to a second grinder pump that would be the county's maintained grinder pump. That's sort of an unusual circumstance, but depending on your topography, that is something that can occur. Let me see. My chat bar is really smart, so it's hard for me to keep.
The next question about water lines. Water lines being replaced in the pines starting next year. Would it be possible to delay that replacement to merge it with sewer installation?
I mean, in theory, yes, but this, and we'll talk about the overall timeline for these projects, but it's typically 3 to 4 years from where we are now till work actually being completed, and we don't have a defined project yet, right? So it could be longer. So I don't. Well, technically, yeah, that's a possibility. There's also a possibility that there is no sewer project in the future, and so I think it would probably be better to just move ahead with the water line.
All right, the next question is related to the capital connection fee. Is the capital connection fee the same $9,351 listed on the county website, or is that part of the project cost?
So the capital connection fee actually is listed in the county code. It is currently, I believe, $93.51.
Yes.
It is going to, is that right, Julia? Julia,
Yes.
Sorry. It is going to change in future years, and that's in the code right now what those changes are going to be. It is also, though, included in what would be your assessment, and we're going to talk a little bit more about how that assessment is created in the upcoming section on the slides.
Okay.
So I guess the answer to that is yes, it's yes. It is that same number, but it is also part of the assessment, and we'll go over how that works.
Okay. And the next question, does the private sewer hookup require a county permit and inspection?
Yes, it does. Yeah.
All right. And who makes the determination of the required equipment on site to connect? Is it a private plumber or a county code or inspector?
So I'd say it would be the plumber, but the plumber is going to have to do work in accordance with the plumbing code, right? So from that extent, it's not necessarily the county code, and the inspector who's enforcing the code is going to be telling the plumber, this is what you have to do to comply with the code, and you have to do this to get a permit. But I guess the terminology, means of methods that would be used would be the plumbers.
Okay. Next question. It sounds like the individual homeowner will be responsible for a lot of the independent project tasks, i.e. their own plumber, as well as would incur a lot of extra cost. What is the value to the homeowner to vote yes on something that's expensive, complicated, and takes up 3 to 4 years for project completion?
So we haven't quite gone through all the funding, so we're trying to address the cost, because we know that's typically one of the questions people have right up front is what are the components of the cost, but in terms of what are some of the benefits that a private owner can see, I can relay some of the things that we've heard, from other meetings, and one of them is, I think, related to the question that had come up before, which is that some houses can have restrictions on any future construction that are related to their septic tanks. Sometimes we've had people have an interest in a pool or something like that on their lot that they don't have room for because they have a septic field. I think a more common occurrence is people have small lots and they don't have room for replacement. And replacing a drain field and a septic system can be expensive if those fail. So there are some costs to maintaining your current septic system, or even if you switch to a nitrogen removing unit, there are some costs, as the homeowner, that you incur with that. In terms of how an individual might value those things, or whether any of those features are compelling to you, we really can't speak to that. I mean, there's a benefit, as we showed earlier. I mean, every septic system that's connected, particularly in the critical area, creates an environmental benefit. And I mean, that's one of the reasons why the county's interested in trying to see more houses connect, and to contribute to that through the subsidies to try to encourage that. As to the other more personal motivations, we really can't speak to those particulars. And we will talk a little bit more about the costs associated with that and how some of those can be offset.
All right, and last question for now. You said you did a topography, but did your group actually walk our neighborhood and see the complexity of installing a sewer system into it? I understand this is conceptual. However, when this was presented at the Broadneck Community Council meeting, we then approached the county regarding this neighborhood. It seemed unlikely for the Pines.
So no, we did not walk the neighborhood, and that's something that we would, if there was further interest in this and we tried to further develop these designs, we would definitely need to come out and do that. These very conceptual layouts were based on sort of high-level overviews of the topography and where is our existing infrastructure and how dense are the septic systems in certain areas. So I can't rule out the possibility that we go look at an area and decide that, oh, this is going to be too expensive. I would say off the top of my head, I doubt we would walk an area of 780 homes and decide that we couldn't figure out a way to serve any of it. But I wouldn't rule out that we see a couple streets that we decide, maybe it's a little better to stay off of that street for different engineering reasons. But as Brian mentioned, if there's an interest in a particular area and we start moving further through the process, we absolutely have to go take a closer look at the on-site issues. And those are all going to affect the cost. I mean, if you're in a small neighborhood with winding roads, and we're trying to dig a sewer that's 15 feet in the ground, I mean, we need to know that if we're going to give everybody a realistic price. We need to know it for ourselves.
All right, we are all caught up in the questions in the chat for now.
Okay, so we talked about the cost. Now let's talk about potential funding sources. So as George mentioned, one of the things that came out of that septic task force led to legislation in the county that the county would provide a subsidy for up to 25% of the total project cost. That's the public side cost of the work here. The state has the Bay Restoration Fund grants for the analysis we're doing here. Those grants can apply in two different manners. For our analysis, we're assuming most of that grant will go to offset those private side costs. And really, for most people, should get those private side costs close to zero. It can also be used to pay for that capital facility connection charge. And then the county is working with the state to try to maximize other grants that could be available. Trying to facilitate these septic connections through a programmatic level, but we'll walk through exactly what we assumed when we develop some of the assessment costs here. And then the homeowner pays the remaining costs, but you do take advantage of low interest state loans. The county assumes that they would apply for a low interest state loan to do this work, and because of the environmental benefit of the work, the assumption is that we would be able to get those low interest loans. So instead of paying the county typical interest rate of 4 to 5% for these assessments, it would be closer to 1.5 to 2%, somewhere there. So talk a little bit more about the subsidy. So the subsidies are based on a ranking system. Basically, this application process, as George will talk about here in a minute, is trying to identify interested communities that provide the most benefit that the county would like to apply a subsidy to. So that's the ranking and through the application process. It is subject to available funding, and it is income-based. The income limit for that full 25% subsidy is $300,000 per year. This mirrors the state DRF income funding limits. If the income was greater than $300,000 a year, it would be half of the subsidy. And the subsidy, what the subsidy is doing is really reducing your overall assessment. Next is the Bay Restoration Fund grants. Again, these could be used to pay for those private on-site costs and the CFCC. It's available after the sewer main is extended. For these private costs, it will be administered through the health department. The state has awarded up to $20,000. Again, it has some income levels, same income levels as I talked about previously. So if you were over that $300,000, you'd be restricted to $10,000. It is the requirement of the state government to fund this program, and the funds aren't paid directly to you. You work with the health department, you get quotes from the master plumbers, and then the health department will pay the plumber directly. So the cost, and try to translate the cost now into the assessment. So again, the cost are the public side costs are the construction costs, but also the cost for designing, doing investigation, looking at, there may need to be borings done, surveys done. All of that is wrapped into the total project cost. Then we take the total project cost. If the project was being built to potentially serve future areas that weren't part of this initial project area, the county would deduct the additional cost for building that infrastructure larger, then deduct subsidy, and if any state grant is available to apply to the assessment, and then add in the county incurred interest, again, low interest loans, but there still is interest, and that would determine the net assessable amount, and divide that by the total number of properties, and that will be the per property assessment. And as George mentioned previously, that would be paid over a 40-year term. So before we go to the next slide, I'm going to answer one of the questions on the next slide about the monthly sewer cost in addition to the initial setup cost. So I'll get to that. The question, if you already have a BAT installed through the BRF, would you be ineligible for the grant of this project? And we have had that discussion with the state, and the state has said, no, you would not. You would not be ineligible, so that's a double negative. You would be eligible for funding still as part of this project. And then what if you sell the house within 40 years? Does the new owner take up the expense? And we'll talk about that in a minute here as well. So let's go to the next slide.
Brian, we missed the one question there about is the project cost fixed, or is there potential for cost growth after the project starts? So we will bid the project when we do the project cost as part of the developing that assessment amount. When we ask the community to vote, or in the neighborhood to vote, that will be based on our estimate at, we'll be at about the 30% design phase. So there is a chance that, those costs, could change a little bit. One of the things that was in the county code was, I believe, if the costs go up by more than 15%, the community has an opportunity to opt back out of that. The final assessment is based on the final project cost. So if, and by that I mean the final bid from the contractor plus any change orders that are issued during the work, the final, design contracts numbers. So the final number will not be exactly the same as the number at the time when we do the ballot vote. But it needs to be less, basically. So there can be some change. If there is an increase, there'll be an opportunity to reconsider if it's over that 15% amount.
And it's important, it is fixed then over that 40 years. It's not going to increase.
Oh, I'm okay. Maybe I misunderstood the question. You're right. Once it's set, it is fixed. If it's whatever, $1,200 a year or whatever it is, but I don't know what the numbers are we have here right now. But that number won't change per year. Yeah. Sorry.
Okay, and I'll address the next question on this slide, and then we'll get to Sophia's question here in a minute. But so for the assessment, we're going to show an example potential range of assessment costs here, and to develop that, we put some assumptions in. So those assumptions, first, we're assuming that it costs the average person $15,000 for the on-site cost plus the CFCC. So that's what the state would cover with the BRF. Then we're assuming that additional $5,000 to get to the $20,000 total could be applied to offset the assessment. So we are getting some benefit from the state for the assessment. As we talked about, for the incomes up to $300,000 per year, there's the 25% county subsidy, but then there are deferment options. So the first deferment is because you are in an eligible area, you could defer up to 50% of that assessment. Anybody in the area could defer that assessment. We'll talk a little bit more about the deferral here in a minute. And then the elderly low income would be eligible to defer 100% of the assessment. And Julie, correct me if I'm wrong, we looked this up on Monday. The elderly low income is over 60 with certain income restrictions, a percentage of the average annual income in the area. Go ahead, Julie.
Hi, Brian. Yes, I'm going to cite the code when I get to my section, but you are correct. It's 60 and over, and then I'll go over the income eligibility.
Okay, thank you. And then the permanently disabled is just being identified through a government disability program as being permanently disabled. Those are the 100% eligibility. The income greater than $300,000 a year gets half the subsidy, still has the option to defer 50%, and gets half of the BRF funding. And then vacant lots, importantly, are not eligible for a subsidy. They wouldn't get any deferment or BRF funding. So the vacant lots would have a higher assessment cost than others. So if we look at your community, and again, this is on the higher side of overall project costs. But this bar graph presents several of those different options. It does include the annual sewer cost. So if you're on public water now, you're getting billed usage charges for public water. If you have sewer added to it, your sewage charges would be metered by your water meter, and you would pay for those. If you don't have public water, then the county charges a flat fee, which is $105 per quarter, and that's based on basically the average consumption for an average household. So what's in these charts is $105 per quarter or $420 per year. That's the annual cost for paying the county for the operation and maintenance of their sewage and treatment systems. And on top of that, the assessment, and if for an average home in this community, we think the total annual cost could be anywhere from about $1,800 to $2,800 per year. Again, that includes the $420 usage charge. If you take the 50% deferral, you cut your assessment in half, and so your total cost would be between $1,100 and $1,600 per year. And then if you have the 100% deferment, all you're paying is that $420 usage charge. You can see for the high income, it would be higher cost because of not getting the full subsidy or state grant. And same with the vacant lot, it would not have any subsidy or any state grant applied to it. So the assessment options, again, this is how do you pay for those costs. The private costs, we would look for helping you with the Bay Restoration Fund grants. Again, hope that most people will be out of pocket nothing for these private on-site costs. Anything that is due will be due at 100% at the connection. The capital facility connection charge can be paid with the Bay Restoration Fund. Anything that's remaining, you have an option to pay at 100% at connection. If you don't want to do that, then it would be financed and rolled into your assessment over that 40-year period. And then the annual assessment has to be paid over 40 years. There is no option to prepay the annual assessment because the county is financing it and will incur those interest charges. So it is paid back over 40 years, and you can defer up to 50%. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Julie to talk a little bit about what those deferment options mean and repaying the deferment.
So Julie, before you start, I want to just answer one question. There was a question here about what happens if you replaced your septic in the last couple of years, 2, 5, or 10. So if you had replaced your septic system or installed a BAT within the last 10 years, you can request an exemption from the connection requirement. That is a process for that, and but you would still you would not have to make the connection for a period of time, but you would still have to pay the annual assessment. And I'll hand it back to you, Jill.
Thank you, George, and thank you, Brian. I'm going to talk about the deferral program that the county has offered to incentivize and make this program more affordable. First, I'm going to start with the partial deferral repayment option. This is for up to 50% of the per property assessment and capital facility connection charge, which is available to all owners of residential properties with existing improvements. Homeowners can choose how much, if any, of the costs they would like to defer, up to 50% of the costs. For example, or in this example, if the property assessment is $90,000 over 40 years, up to $45,000 of the assessment costs can be deferred until the property is sold or transferred, whichever occurs first. This would bring your annual assessment payment down from $2,250 per year to $1,125 annually. If the property is sold or transferred before the 40-year assessment period, the owner would need to repay the deferred $45,000, and the remaining $1,125 annual assessment would then be transferred to the buyer. Next slide, please. Under the full deferral repayment program option, the full deferral of the assessment payment is available, as Brian mentioned earlier, for disabled and elderly residents who meet certain eligibility requirements as defined in County Code 13-5-815. And I'm going to read that exemption. It's any single-family dwelling owned or occupied by any person 60 years of age or older with a combined gross income that is less than the maximum income level, or a surviving spouse with a combined gross income that is less than the maximum income level, or a person receiving disability benefits as a result of a finding of permanent or total disability under the Social Security Act, the United States Civil Service Commission, Veterans Administration, or the Railroad Retirement Act, shall be exempt from the user connection charges, capital facility connection charges, capital facilities assessment charges, and the front foot assessment charges until the sale or transfer of the property, at which time the above charges become due and payable by the property owner. The full deferral defers each annual assessment, which is $2,250, until the property is sold or otherwise transferred. So in this case, you would pay nothing until the property is sold or transferred. At the time of transfer, all the payments are then due. All the deferred payments are due. In this example, in our example here on the screen, the property is transferred after 10 years. So you would pay $22,500 at the time of transfer. The remaining annual assessment payments of $2,250 would be paid by the new owner for the remaining years, and in this example, 30 years. Next slide, please. This table compares the two deferral methods to show you how much would need to be paid back at property transfer. We're assuming an annual payment of $2,250 based on a per property assessment of $90,000. In the case of a full deferral, the required payment at the time of property transfer depends on when the property is transferred. After 5 years, $11,250 would be due. After 10 years, $22,500. After 15 years, $33,750, and after 20 years, $45,000. For the partial deferral, $45,000 would be due at the time of property transfer, regardless of the number of years. Additionally, you would have been paying $1,125 per year, which is 50% of the annual assessment, which would accrue for the years you have owned. For the years that you are paying the assessment. At this time,
Julie, can I interject for just 1 second?
Of course.
Yeah, sorry. So I'm noticing that on the text here, we have the wrong numbers, $72,000 and the $1,800 a year. So we will correct that when we post these slides on the community webpage, and we'll talk more about that in a little bit. The numbers on the table are correct.
Yes, on the left side of the slide, yes. We will correct that before we post it. Thank you, George.
And Julie, to answer somebody's previous question as well, can you comment on outside of deferral, if you would like not to defer at all?
Yes.
What happens to the assessment when you sell the home?
What happens to the assessment? I think that's best answered by a slide that we have in a previous slide with the bar charts. So you don't have to defer the payments on your assessment. So, so the annual assessment would be $2,250 in this example, in the 90,000.
Yeah.
And that would go with the property essentially when the property was sold.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah, a question we've had in other meetings has been, and maybe that's where this question's coming from. How do I make sure the largest assessment amount gets passed on to the next owner? And the way to do that is to not take the deferments.
Right.
Okay.
Okay, at this point, I'm going to turn it back over to you, George.
George, I do want to address, there was a kind of a two-part question in the chat. The second part of the question, I believe Julie addressed, but the first part has to do with the cost of the overall project. And the question is, would the cost for the overall project include repairing the damage to the roads, yards, driveways, etc., resulting from the work to switch over to the septic systems?
Right. So, Rakia, you think you can go back to the graphic with the private side and public side costs?
Yeah.
So the county's contractor will be doing anything that's on what we're showing here as the public side cost. So if there is, and so where the sewer clean out would be put is just on the private side of where the public right-of-way line is. So if there is, yard disturbance or some other disturbance that's within the public right-of-way, the county's contractor will make those repairs. Anything that occurs from that edge of the public right-of-way back to the resident would be the responsibility of the homeowner. And so in some cases, that's where costs can be increased on what we're calling here the private side cost. So if you have to cut across your driveway, or if you're cutting through a planting bed or something like that later needs to be reconstructed, those are some of the personal on-site differences that can affect your costs. And I think we covered the second part, of that question already about the deferment.
Yes. And there's one more question here related to the payments. How are payments allocated to pay down each part of the assessment? Equal percentage?
I think I can answer that. Julia, if I'm off, you can correct me. I believe the number is that total assessment per property is just divided by 40 equal installments. And, and that's how it's set up.
George, you are correct.
Okay, thanks. Okay, these are great questions, so we appreciate everybody. Let me see. We left off at the application process, is that right? Yes. Okay. So
George,
now we're going to talk. Oh,
George,
yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Just to clarify, it does end up being 4 equal installments. Is that what you were? The annual installments are 4 equal installments.
Oh, okay. That might have been the question. I might have misunderstood it. Yes.
Yes.
So for each year is the same, and then it's going to be split within that year in 4 equal installments.
No, right. Well, yes.
Okay.
I mean, it's 40 equal installments.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about the overall process, just to explain what it is, kind of how it works. If you want to go to the next slide. So, as we mentioned at the beginning, this is an information meeting for the community. This is not a vote on anything, and it's not a binding meeting of any sort. It's really the beginning of the process. As Rakia noted, we received some interest from different people in the community, and our major goal right now is that the The legislation enabling this program is new. The program has recently been developed, so we're trying to let people know about it. And we've been doing meetings throughout the county, starting like midsummer, just talking to different communities about the program. If there's an interest in a project, we try to work with a community representative or a coordinator to try to develop a project area and an application. And we'll talk more about what's in an application in a little bit. Once we do that, we will rank communities, and we'll talk about the ranking system. And then if we're going to offer the subsidy to a community, we would come back with a follow-up meeting to talk about what we think will develop these costs in a little more detail, and have a second presentation to the community of what we would call the conceptual engineering report. And that would have a little more detail than we talked about tonight, but it would still be pretty conceptual. At that point, the community would need to decide whether they want to move forward into the formal petition process, which is step 3. With that, there is a submittal from residents in an area asking for sewer to be extended. There's a map that goes along with the petition. There's forms that go along with that. I need to pause for 1 second. I just got a message about my computer is going to shut down for some reason. Brian, can you do the rest of this slide while I try to stop this setting? Sorry about this. I think it's going to reboot.
Where did you leave off? I apologize.
I left off on step 3. I think I have to stop it from rebooting. So let me.
Okay. Yeah. So once that formal petition is submitted to DPW, and that would be everybody in the project area would we would need 50% plus 1 in that project area to acknowledge they were submitting a petition. The county would do the preliminary engineering and cost updates, and those costs would then be translated into the assessment, which would then be on a rate ballot. And so you would get a ballot that said your annual assessment for connecting to public sewer will be X. And then everybody in the community would need to vote yes or no on that. If they did not vote, it would be counted as a no vote. So you need 50% plus 1 yes votes for the project to proceed. And then if the project does get approval, DPW would finish the engineering and construction. The master plumber would connect the residences to the sewer system, and you would be connected, and the assessment would start at that point when the county's project is completed. Next up. So the petition process, we talked about, go back 1 slide real quick, I'll do it quickly, Ricky. The steps for the petition process: the formal petitions filed, the county does preliminary engineering, there is a formal public hearing at that point, and the assessment ballot is sent with the ballot results, and then the next steps are to finish the design and perform the construction, and then again, that's when the assessment begins.
All right, before we go on, I do want to address this one question that just popped up. Does the community need to vote twice? Once to petition and then later to approve moving forward?
So, George, you there? You want to answer that? I see your phone.
I know. I'm almost there. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
I was not fast enough to beat my computer, so yeah. Okay, I'm sorry. Could you repeat the question?
Sure. The question is, does the community need to vote twice? once to petition and then later to approve moving forward?
The initial petition is not actually a vote. You'll be asked to sign a form that indicates that you're interested in the petition or not. So it's not a formal vote in the same sense as the vote that occurs later. So in some ways, the answer is yes. You're going to be asked at two different points. Are you interested in this petition? And the first one, it's not really a vote. It's just you're going to mark off on a form, yeah, I'm interested, or no, I'm not interested. The second vote after we do the schematic design report is a more formal vote. You're going to be sent a ballot from Julie's office that's going to say, okay, I agree to pay this assessment amount, as described, by the county for sewer service. So there are two points where we're going to go back to the community in a petition, or, there's 2 points in the petition process where we have to have that 50% approval. And one of them is on the initial completion of the form, and the second one is the formal vote.
Is it fair to say, George, that on that first, whether you call it a vote or a form, that is still, that you've not committed yourself to paying any costs at that point, because that's correct. If they don't have 50 on the first, when you're filling out the forms at the beginning, if you don't have the 50%, then there's no petition project. It never actually comes to us in utility design. If we go through the formal vote and the ballots are counted, and more than 50% are against the project, that's the end of the project, and there's no cost passed on to the homeowners at that point. It's only after, if the formal vote is approved and then the project moves forward, if for some reason it then is stopped, the community can actually counter petition, but at that point the county would seek to get reimbursed for the cost between the schematic design report and the costs have been incurred up to the point where the project stopped. But if after that ballot vote is no, then that's the end of the project, and there's no cost passed back to the residents at that point.
Okay, thank you. The next question has to do, can anyone start that application and petition? And we do have a slide coming up that addresses the steps you take to begin the application process. So I'm just going to ask them to defer that just a few moments here. As I mentioned earlier, we have set up a community page, the Pines on the Severn community page, for residents of the area to find out more information. And this is the page where we'll also be posting a recording to tonight's meeting, as well as the presentation slides. Here is the direct short link here, bit.ly/Pines on Severn. Or if you would like to navigate to it from the main Our Water page, you'll go to the septic to sewer page, enter your address. When you hit search, it shows that you are in an eligible area, and then you'll see a blue box to prompt you to navigate to that community page. One of the other things that we're asking residents to do is to indicate their interest. After hearing the information presented tonight, if you are interested in moving forward with an application, that helps us determine the interest. There isn't a high threshold that the county's determined for interest, but we would like to get a sense of the interest in the community for moving forward. George, any other points you want to add on this? Okay, I think he's joining back in the meeting here. Here's more information about submitting the application. The application process is now open, and as we mentioned earlier, we'd like to designate a community representative to apply online, and you see the link to the application listed here. The application would include a community name, a primary contact person, an outline of the potential project area, And you'll see here the show of community support. And again, that can be what's documented through that septic to sewer comment page that we just reviewed.
And I would add, Rakia, for the group here, because of the size of the areas that we're talking about, the county would be open before somebody submits an application to further discussion or looking at maps and the sewer layouts and what makes sense from a connection standpoint to work with various community representatives if that was requested. And then while I'm unmuted, I'll address Mr. White's comment. The dry well and septic tank, so it would need to be abandoned. There's county code requirements for proper abandonment of a septic tank. At a minimum, it needs to be pumped out, obviously, but then depending on if you have a concrete or metal septic tank, depends on what that abandonment looks like. Either way, it does not have to be pulled out of the ground, but the metal tank may have to be crushed, whereas the concrete tank would just get perforated and filled in. And those costs are part of the on-site private costs. Now, we talked about using bay restoration funds to potentially cover some of those on-site costs, so we'd look to help you facilitate getting those private costs covered.
Great, thank you. Here's some detail about the application review process. We've had some questions come up in past meetings about how it works. DPW does rank eligible communities according to specific criteria that you see listed in the graphic here. It's important to note that the ranking system does favor large communities, and once the application is submitted, it's valid for 3 years, so a community would not have to resubmit every single year. This is the end of our slides, but we are happy to remain on and answer more of the questions that I see are popping up in the chat here. So I'll go ahead and address these. The first one is, what is the county construction throughout capacity for conversion?
Throughput capacity.
I'm sorry, throughput capacity.
So the county's the goal is converting 200 septic systems a year, and the financial modeling that the county did was based on 200 systems per year. Obviously, an area as large as this exceeds those numbers. That doesn't mean the county wouldn't do a project like this. It would just take longer to spread those costs over a large period. So the assumed capacity is 200 per year. That doesn't mean, again, it doesn't limit the size of the project or mean that if there were 250 homes or 150 homes, that those projects would be looked on disfavorably.
And is that across all properties in Anne Arundel County or just our community?
No, all 200 throughout Anne Arundel County, 200 properties per year throughout Anne Arundel County.
All right, next question. When would the county need a sign of community support? Would it be 3 months from now?
I think we're looking to close the application process in mid-November, so about 2 months from now. That's when we'd like to see it.
All right, when the petition is sent, will it mention the high cost of connectivity on the private side?
I don't believe the petition would talk about the private side costs, but it certainly would be communicated through the public meeting that George talked about beforehand, and that property owners should be as informed as they possibly can be on what those potential costs are. And at that time, we'd have more definition as well, and on the state funding and what you might expect from state funding.
Okay, next question has to do with the show of community support, 50+1. However, let's go down a lane. House 1 is yes, House 2 is yes, House 3 is no. Does it stop there?
George, I see you're back.
Yep, I'm back. Thanks, and I apologize everybody for being kicked out. I was planning originally to do the meeting from home, so I probably decided to tell my work computer restarting at 7:15 was going to be a perfect time. So, as the project area, when we say it needs to be contiguous from the connection to the county system, we mean that all the lots that are in the project have to be a contiguous line. Within the project area, if that 50% plus one vote for it, then everybody has to connect. So we can't leapfrog over a particular individual lot. So it wouldn't necessarily matter if lot number 3 in the line said no, if the majority within that whole project area says yes, then lot number 3 would still have to connect. And this is true for the petition process in general. So if you're doing a water petition, it's the same 50+1 vote. We were talking to the community last night, and I was mentioning we had a water petition go through where we had 8 residents vote yes and 7 voted no.
All right, next question.
Yeah, so the question is that, can the 50+1 force the others to take on that connection? So that is yes, that answer is yes, and that's why it's important to think of it as a community decision. So Rakia, when I joined in, I guess by virtue of re-logging in, I lost all of the old chats. So were you guys able to catch up on the chats while I was wandering around in the internet here?
We were. We discussed the community page and the application process, also what's involved in the application review.
Okay. One thing I think we didn't really mention is, we didn't talk about nitrogen removal units or BAT systems. Those are not the focus of the program, but we definitely want to encourage people, even if septic connections aren't a fit, for your community or your neighborhood, any switch to technology that helps remove nitrogen is going to be beneficial to the waterways. So we're not, it's not our intent in any of this to disparage BAT systems. That's just not the focus of our program. I see that if there's a contact person for additional questions. So the best way to reach us would be to go to that community webpage that Rakia probably talked about, and submit a comment in there, and that'll come to one of us on the team, and we can reach back out to you guys. And I would say, I know I missed when you were talking about the community webpage. We really like to see if we can get some feedback on that for people to let us know if they're interested or not interested. And also, we've been doing a lot of these presentations, and we have a lot more coming up. So, any feedback on, the content and the presentation, that can kind of help us. We know there's a lot of information that we're presenting to people, And, we're always sort of tweaking the presentation to try to respond to questions, but any suggestions would be well taken.
And George, there's another question. Would the assessment be added to the water bill or the tax bill?
I have to defer that one to Julie.
So this goes on, this actual bill goes, you know what, I'm not 100% sure, so can I get back to everybody? Because I'm not sure if it goes on the property bill or if it goes on the water bill, and I'm going to have to find out.
I think what Kim has said before, Julie, is that it's actually a separate bill from.
Yeah, and that's what I want to find out, because I've also heard that it might be. I'm not sure if it's a separate bill, if it's on the water bill. If it's actually on. Well, when she says it's a separate bill, it might be separate from the tax bill and on the water bill. So that's what I want to make sure that we clarify. If it's another bill, if they'll get a third bill. So if we could get back to the folks.
Yes. If we have some open questions from this, what we'll try to do is when we have those answers, we'll put those on the community webpage as well.
I might be able to find out right now. Hold on.
Julie, there's a question about, is there a lien ever placed on your mortgage?
Yes, there can be a lien paid for unpaid assessments, yes.
Okay, so we've gone through all of the material and that we wanted to go through tonight. Our team will hang on a little longer for any additional questions, but we want to thank everybody for your time, and I appreciate your patience. I'm sorry I got thrown out there at the 2/3 point, but thanks everybody for joining us tonight.
Thanks very much. This was very informative.
Thanks, we appreciate that.